Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Certification Assurance and Reliability Masterclass session. We're very glad to have you here with us today. We would like to start by thanking our sponsors, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, Ping An, Moody's ESG Solutions, Luxembourg Green Exchange, Citi, Refinitiv, BNP Paribas, IHS Markit, Alliance Bernstein, FSD Africa, Inter-American Development Bank, ICMA, Mizuho, IFC, and Ashurst. We would like to thank them. It would not be possible to do our conference without you. Before we start, just a few important reminders to the audience. Please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. Thoughts, comments, and any other queries about the conference can be addressed via the chat box, where we have our team ready to assist you. Live interpretation is available in Portuguese, Spanish, Mandarin, and French. The headphone icon on your screen will lead you to the options. All sessions are being recorded and will be available to you on this app until November. Make use of the very exciting tools that SwapCard offers. Networking with thousands of attendees and visit our virtual booth so you'll find information about our latest reports and learn more about our incredible sponsors. Members of the media, for any interview requests, please visit the Climate Bonds virtual booth, where our comms team is ready to assist you. Many thanks for your presence and enjoy the next presentation. Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luisa. Hello, everybody. My name is Marina Strobolido. I am the head of certification at the Climate Bonds Initiative. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to our annual conference and to this certification masterclass to be delivered by my colleague, Brian Robertson. Only after I joined the Climate Bonds Initiative 6 months ago did I truly appreciate the concern that unless global emissions decrease by half this decade, the effects on our planet will become irreversible. The urgent need for decarbonization and the transition to a more sustainable way of living requires massive redirection of capital away from fossil fuels and into clean energy, as many of the speakers this conference will argue. As Krista mentioned earlier today, the mission of the CBI is to mobilize a 120 trillion bond market for climate change solutions and to promote investment in projects and assets necessary for a rapid transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. In this context, back in 2014, the Climate Bonds Initiative developed a detailed climate screening criteria for a number of sectors and established the Climate Bond Standard and Certification Scheme. This initiative included the development of an oversight scheme for the network of approved verifiers who conduct the independent external reviews and provide assurance over the climate integrity of certified climate bonds. At that time, the CBI scheme provided what was truly missing in the green bond market, an objective standard definition of greenness. The certification scheme offers issuers an easy-to-apply framework of attaining an internationally acknowledged label of greenness of their bonds, and offers investors the assurance that the bond proceeds will be allocated to projects that are truly aligned with achieving the limit of 1.5 degrees by 2050, as prescribed by the Paris Agreement. The scheme aims to meet the particular needs of investors in the green finance space for enhanced transparency, price stability, and predictability. The CBI taxonomy and scientific sectoral criteria that Brian will go into, as well as the robustness of our certification process, provide the basic ingredients for meeting issuer and investor needs. CBI's focus to date has been bringing credibility to use of proceeds bond. However, the challenges posed by the exponential growth of the green bond market and the increased focus on the hard-to-abate sectors make it imperative for the CBI to enhance and broaden the certification scheme to incorporate new green product innovations, scientific developments, and regional taxonomy initiatives. We are working towards adapting our certification scheme towards a transitions approach across all sectors and to develop detailed climate screening criteria and transition pathways for a number of high-emitting sectors associated with transition, including cement, chemicals, steel, and oil and gas. Our buildings criteria for certification already use a transition approach. It is also our intention to certify instruments beyond the use of proceeds bonds. A fundamental change to our climate bond standard will be the ability to certify entities which adopt and implement a Paris-aligned transition strategy, while maintaining the fundamental requirements for use of proceeds bonds, namely a binary assessment, simplicity, transparency, and science-based criteria. As most of you know, the European Commission published its proposed regulation on European green bonds with the label EUGB last July. The proposed regulation defines the framework for those bonds that contribute to the environmental objectives specified by the EU taxonomy regulation published last year. The Commission intends to adopt complementary EU taxonomy delegated act in the autumn of 2021, which will cover nuclear energy as well as natural gas and related technology. The EU label, which will be voluntary for EU issuers, will also be available to non-EU issuers, provided the requirements of the regulation are met. The proposed EU standard adopts ICMA's green bond principles and mirrors the governance framework of the Climate Bonds Standard version 3, which is now widely acknowledged as the international best practice in the labeling of green bonds. The proposed legislation has built on the recommendations of the technical expert group, in which many stakeholders, including the CBI and ICMA, have participated. The proposal, whose primary objective is to enable investors to identify bonds that are truly green, focuses on three areas: defining green economic activities, standardizing external review practices and improving trust in external reviewers, and imposing a registration scheme for external reviewers through ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority. For a CBI certified debt instrument, the use of proceeds must align with the CBI taxonomy, while the EUGB label requires alignment to the EU taxonomy. There are close similarities as well as differences in the respective taxonomies, which the CBI is reviewing on a sector-by-sector basis to ensure our certification scheme remains best-in-class label. The EU taxonomy also includes projects that do not meet the criteria currently, but will do so within 5 years, provided the issuer has a credible plan for getting there. This is not yet available under the CBI scheme. Both standards, EU and CBI, require pre- and post-issuance external reviews. But in the case of the CBI scheme, annual reporting is required beyond the full allocation of the proceeds and for the term of the bond. Under the CBI scheme, the external reviews need to be conducted by CBI-approved verifiers, the oversight of which is currently conducted by us in-house. The European Commission has delegated this task to ESMA. In addition to taxonomy differences, there are other issues where the two standards diverge. An important aspect is the proposed partial grandfathering clause in the EU standard, where in case of changes in the relevant taxonomy criteria, the issuer will have 5 years in which to align to retain the EU GB label. Conversely, a CBI certified bond retains its certification label for as long as the criteria and the standard applicable at initial certification are met. The CBI scheme normally requires 2 years for the full allocation of the proceeds, whereas the EU standard will permit 5. No doubt you will hear more from us on the alignment with the EU scheme. And without further ado, conscious of the time, I shall hand you over to Brian, who will go into the details of the CBI certification process. But I will, of course, be available together with our colleague Maggie to answer any questions that you may put in the chat. Thank you for your time and enjoy the conference.
Many thanks, Marina. I assume everyone can see my screen. It seems to be highlighted on my end. Just to quickly go through the speakers. So you just heard from Marina. I'm Brian. We also have 2 guest speakers today, who I'm going to introduce a little later. Osmar Bambini, who's the Chief Innovability Officer of umgrauemeio, 1.5 degrees, excuse me. And Alex Vervuurt, the Lead Auditor of Bureau Veritas, Brazil. We do have a disclaimer for this presentation. I'm not going to read it out, but it does apply and it will be available in the recording. You can pause it and read it at your leisure. So I'll be presenting this masterclass, and the people who will be responding to any chat inquiries will be Marina, you just heard from, and Maggie Eloy, the certification assistant. So they're going to be overseeing the chat and question and answer. A little bit more housekeeping before I start. To reach out to us on the booth, you can simply send a message here. This is regardless of this event. You can reach out to us here during the conference. Our contact information is also in the booth. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see the general email here for certification. That email goes to all 3 of us, to myself, to Marina, and to Maggie. And lastly, we also have a gift pack. North America, we call it a swag pack, with 3 digital goodies for you. There's 2 videos related to certification and our new certification brochure, which came out last week. So again, in the booth, you can go down and click on this, and it'll lead you to the site where you can download those 3 goodies. This masterclass will be available in the app again, so if you miss anything, you can see the recording until November. So this is a 2-hour workshop total. There's 4 sections to it. We're going to start with section 2, issuing green bonds and the certification process. Then I'm going to go through a masterclass on verifying green debt issuances. And I've put this together so that it should have some valuable content, whether you're a verifier, a prospective verifier, an issuer or prospective issuer, an underwriter or an investor or a researcher. So I tried to make it, I tried to have a broad scope. And lastly, we have a very interesting case study to present. It's going to be the certification journey, not of a huge bank, but of a startup in Brazil. So we'll come to that soon. Let's start by talking about issuing green bonds. So the general process for issuing green bonds, there are 3 steps to it. The first one is for any bond, you go through a certain number of predictable steps. If you want to label the bond, then you need some additional steps, and these are here. And then the third step is to launch the bond into the market. So it's quite a predictable process. Our focus of this presentation, because of limited time, our scope is exclusively, we're going to talk about issuing a labeled bond, the additional steps. So it's assuming that you're familiar with the mechanics of your structuring and issuing a bond. We're going to be focusing again exclusively on the labeling part. So there's a tendency now to get external reviews done in order to label the bond or to make it more distinctive. And external review, it refers to the independent assessment of a bond's green credentials. And this is provided to the issuer by an external auditor, a reviewer, or maybe a verifier. Almost all external reviews for green bonds, most of them fall under three categories. Either a second party opinion, it's also called an SPO, if you've heard the term, assurance, or certification. Most external reviews can provide both a second party opinion and an assurance report against the climate bond standard. So those two often go together. Additionally, an issuer can also opt for an external review in the form of a scoring or a rating process, but we're not going to dive into that today. External reviewers are generally engaged either during the process of setting up a green bond framework, which we're going to talk about, or after the issuer has put together a green bond framework. And this review is normally made before the roadshow. This is because the issuer can then use the independent review as a way to promote the green credentials of the debt during the roadshow. It's now common practice for the review to accompany the bond's prospectus when it's sent to potential investors. There are different external review methodologies. Going to go through them. So we'll start with the second party opinion. These are the most popular forms of external review in the green bond market. They're independent. They are research-based assessments of the sustainability credentials of green bonds and what underlies those green bonds or those green loans, any debt instrument really. So it's really about the underlying assets or activities. The approach is based on a methodology, and it's generally designed by the opinion provider. And it's usually in alignment with the green bond principles. These second party opinions, they're normally issued at pre-issuance, and they usually don't have a follow-up after the debt has been issued. And they can vary quite a lot depending on the methodology used by the opinion provider. So you will see tendencies when you read enough SPOs, but there's no kind of standard way of doing it aside from doing it within the frames of the green bond principles. For example, Cicero's Shades of Green, that's a methodology that does give transparent information on how well a green bond or a sustainability bond aligns with a low carbon resilient future. There are second party opinions from Cicero. They're graded light, medium, or dark green. And they essentially assess the environmental soundness of green projects. Assurance, for our purposes, it means an independent audit conducted following the procedures described in ISAE 3000. And that's a standard used by accountants to process historical, non-financial information. As an assurance opinion, it provides an assessment of both the green credentials of the bond, as well as of the internal procedures established by the issuer. So it gives more transparency to the issuance. These opinions are used by independent third parties, for example, to audit. And essentially, they provide an assessment of a bond's eligibility against, in our case, the climate bond standard. Scoring and rating. So this would be a report from a rating agency or potentially a specialized firm, and it will score an issuer's framework. And again, that's the green financing framework or the green bond framework. And it will score that against an established range of information rather than an opinion stated by the second party opinion. Okay, so it puts it against certain metrics. These metrics are usually proprietary methods or data sets. And because they have pre-established categories, that can compromise the objectiveness and the harmonization of the analysis, right? Sometimes you just have to decide whether something fits the box or no, and that might not necessarily be based on something external or objective. These are normally issued at pre-issuance, and excuse me. And again, no follow-up after issuance. Certification. This applies to debt issuances which are verified to conform with the climate bond standard. These are also called certified climate bonds. The scheme, as Marina mentioned, it acts as a universal adapter across jurisdictions. It incorporates the green bond principles, incorporates the green loan principles, and it's being aligned with the proposed EU Green Bond Standard, as well as the guidelines and rules in China, ASEAN, Japan, India, and as well as other countries and regions. The climate bond certification, it works as an effective screening tool for investors to ensure that the standards for climate integrity of their fixed income investments are sound. It will also demonstrate the employment of best practices in the management of proceeds and also best practices in terms of transparency. It's the only global standard currently that is run through a secretariat and via a global network of approved verifiers. It's independent, it's transparent. We collaborate with dedicated working groups that work pro bono. All of our work is published for public use. And these working groups that help us put together standards and criteria, they function at two levels. The first level is a technical working group, and the second level is an industry working group. And basically our aim with the certification scheme is that it's easy to use and straightforward, and then it's designed to go hand in hand with the general issuance process. So if I had to put it, we want it to be seamless, in other words. So here are some examples of some external reviews. One up here, we have, for example, from S&P Global Scoring. This, for example, is a Cicero Shades of Green report. And then this, for example, is an assurance report. And the typical language of a assurance report that provides limited or reasonable assurance would be nothing has come to the verifier's attention that causes us to believe that in all material aspects, the green bond is not in conformance with the low carbon transport of the standards and the sector criteria. So some of the benefits of certification that issuers have reported to us and that we've come across are an avoidance of greenwashing. It tends to really diminish any possible claims around greenwashing. Investor diversification, a lower cost of capital, oversubscription, a stickier pool of investors who stick around for the long term, tighter yields, and general greenness. The types of financial instruments that we can currently certify, there's quite a wide range. They go from deposits to securitizations, loans, municipal bonds, project finance. Sometimes it'll be tranches in a specific deal that will be certified. And this is not an exhaustive list. The exhaustive list you can find in the standard. And in terms of the issuances of certified climate bonds, this is happening worldwide. So in the dark purple, these are countries where issuers have had certified bonds, and gradually the map is getting filled. Where you can see the stars here, these are examples of sovereign issuers who have had their bonds certified as well. As Marina mentioned, we have ongoing work into expanding the scope of our certifiable mechanisms. We're looking at different approaches. For example, repos. We're looking at potential alignment with different eco-labels. We're looking at leases. We're looking at potentially certifying assets directly. We're looking at funds, options around that. And entities would be our transitions program, where we look at potentially certifying, a company and its direction. Our goal would be is to basically enable certification of the universe of green debt. So, using the analogy here of ice cream, whether it's a green flavor, a blue, or transition, or enabling, we eventually want to cover that. But we do have processes to get there. We are working on it. It does take some time, but we do make progress. So let's go back from that digression into issuing the labeled bond. And let's talk about this specifically in terms of certification. Okay, so we've looked at the options available to label. Now we're going to hone in, we're going to focus on certification itself. So let's look at the certification process. It's quite straightforward. There are 5 steps. And these 5 steps are what you need to do to certify your issuance and to keep it certified during the term of the debt. So the first step is the issuer will begin by preparing a bond. In a nutshell, this means identifying assets or activities that meet the criteria that we have and documenting their plans and approaches for their transition with this debt into the new playing field with a green bond framework. It can be a green loan framework, a green financing framework, but that document is critical. The next step is to engage a verifier and provide the verifier with the information to enable the verifier to conduct a verification. Now, these 2 steps, they don't always happen sequentially. Sometimes they happen at the same time. It's not like you have to completely finish one before moving on to the next one. This is just an example of the typical flow. Third step is you apply to the Climate Bonds Initiative. You give us certain documents, and then we review that. And then we decide whether we can award the certification, whether that's a pre-issuance certification or a post-issuance certification. Once we give you that, you have a certificate, then the issuer can issue the bond and use the certified climate bond mark. So now the bond's out there. Now the money's out there. You want to confirm the certification post-issuance, which is another verification report. Usually it's by the same verifier, but that's not a requirement. This happens within 24 months of issuance of the debt. Now, I'm not going to talk about programmatic certification in this masterclass, although it is a very common option. Basically, it's where you go through this process, but you use the same first verification report, and you can issue multiple bonds or debt instruments against the same assets. Okay, that's programmatic summed up. Programmatic post-issuance is 12 months after. Programmatic certification. Post-issuance certification is 12 months after, but usually it's 24 months after if it's an individual certification. And the last step is to report annually. So once those 2 reports are out of the way, the issuer will prepare a very simple report each year during the term of the bond. This is not an annual financial report by any means. We have a 3-page template on the website. I can point it out later. And you simply have to fill it out, send it back to us. And it has what we consider the critical information that needs to be provided to us and to the public. That's the certification process. So in order to get to this stage here, where you're submitting the documents to us, let's just define the documents. So there are 4. The first one is a climate bond information form. That's a spreadsheet. It's in Excel. And it basically gives us here in the certification team an overview of what you intend to do with the bond structure, for example, the maturity, the name, who the main stakeholders are, the assets or activities involved, and so on. Signed certification agreement. The third is the green financing framework. Again, that might be a green bond framework or green loan framework. And lastly is the verification report. We need all 4 documents in order to process a certification. And specifically, the climate bond information form is going to serve as an overview for numbers 3 and 4. And what we check is everything has to align. It needs to tell, the same story. And we have to make sure that everything went through the motions to be awarded a certification. The process we use internally, once we get these 4 documents from you, we use a 2-person review process. The first review, the person, it might be myself or Marina or Maggie, will onboard the documents and perform an extensive review. So read everything and then usually juxtapose the information in the documents to the requirements of the standard and the sector criteria that applies. So that's the first phase. Then this is either recommended and passed on to the second reviewer internally, or in the first phase review, we will go back to the issuer or the verifier and request clarifications. Once this is completely satisfied, it's then passed on to the phase 2 reviewer, who does the same process again, who also has the benefit of having our notes. So no work has to be repeated. Again, the phase 2 reviewer might go back to the issuer verifier with additional questions. Once both reviewers have signed off on it, then we prepare the documents, we review them, and then we send them out, and that wraps everything up. This can take typically 2-3 business days. It can take 10 business days, depending, if there are several different sectors involved, or it's very complex, or we need to go back and forth with different verifiers or issuers. We try to turn them around as fast as we can, but we never compromise our process in doing so. So let's look at what seems to be the biggest challenge from the issuer or verifier's side of aligning a certification with our standard and our sector criteria. So getting the package right. It tends to be here in terms of the identification of assets or activities. And again, this can be done by the issuer, or it can be done, the verifier will sometimes help as well. But it's in this area here that this work up front has to be done, aligning the assets and activities. There are different options to do this. It can be done in-house if the issuer is a bank or a power company or whatever. It might have the resources to do that internally, simply to look at the assets and activities that the company has, read the criteria, and line them up. Very often, an issuer will go to an underwriter, like an investment bank, and the investment bank will do this process. Often, the issuer will have contact with an approved verifier by us, and the verifier can help the issuer align the assets and the activities that would apply. Here is an example of verifiers approved by the Climate Bonds Initiative. These are just some examples. The list is expanding, although it does expand slowly. We have quite a rigorous onboarding process, but there are several different verifiers to choose from. And going back to the options, again, in-house, underwriter, verifier, or we've also seen sometimes consultants are hired. It might be a technical expert, it might be an engineering company, but all these people can help you, make sure that your assets and activities would be certifiable according to our criteria. Something very important to point out is there's a difference between the taxonomy and the sector criteria. They're two different things, although there is overlap. And when it comes to certification, they're very different things. Let's talk about the taxonomy.
Hi everyone, we had a small technical issue. I think we have Brian back now. Brian, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I assume everyone can see my screen on the taxonomy. As I was saying before, got cut off. So includes research from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as the International Energy Agency. And it's also benefited from the input of hundreds of industry and technical experts. In a nutshell, it identifies the assets and projects that are needed to deliver a low carbon economy. It gives some emission screening criteria that are consistent with the 2-degree global warming target set by the Paris Agreement. So it definitely serves an important purpose. The taxonomy, it's a major support in the development of green finance. And the reason is because one of the main barriers to increasing the supply of green debt instruments is the identification of green assets and projects in the first place. And there's a lack of awareness around, one, what these are, and two, how to identify them in the first place. How can you determine whether a mortgage is green or whether, transport is really low carbon or not? That's what the taxonomy intends to help with. So it basically gives definitions for green assets. And this is key to safeguarding the market from the risk that I mentioned before of greenwashing. The challenge is to develop definitions that are, on the one side, scientifically robust, but that are also practical. So it has to be usable by issuers, and it has to be able to give confidence to investors. Now, this overlaps with the sector criteria, but when it comes to certification, our focus is on the eligibility criteria for the given sector. So, if we go back up here, for example, this is the taxonomy. And let's say if we took energy and we took solar projects. Solar projects qualify. They also qualify for certification, but not all solar projects qualify for certification. And that's why for a solar project, or for any project for that matter, the taxonomy, it'll point out that a certification might be possible, right? If it's not here, then it won't be possible. It means it might be possible. But it's really going to be the sector criteria that's going to determine whether or not it can be certified or not. So again, not to belabor the point, but for certification, it's the sector criteria, not the taxonomy that you need to rely on. Types of assets that can be certified. Again, there's a lot of overlap with the taxonomy. And going back to this process here, I'd like to flesh it out just to show you how it would work to identify assets or activities so that they can be certified. So I'm just going to show you the process. And this is in addition to the recording that you're going to have of this presentation. But in the gift pack that we put together for you, one of the videos is how to use the sector criteria. And it's a 22-minute video that shows you this process I'm going to show you now, but in much more detail. And it shows you basically how to go through the documents that we have available to make this process as straightforward as possible. So if you were doing it live, for example, you could have the video open, you could have your assets and have the criteria, and potentially, get a lot done in a single session. So just pointing that out, that's in the gift pack for you. So the first step in terms of determining alignment with the climate bond standard and the eligibility of assets or use of proceeds is to check the current climate bond sector criteria. Again, these are examples of the criteria. And let's say, just for this example, let's say that you had a recycling plant. So the first step you would do is you would go to our website, and these are the sector criteria that we have available for certification. And I'll provide the link to this in the presentation as well. You can see here on the left-hand side, these are all the sectors. So you would click on waste management here, for example, and it would take you to this page here. The pages all have the same format, so it's easy to navigate. And at the lower right-hand side of the web page, you're going to see a list of resources, all hyperlinked. You can click them to go to other resources. You don't have to read all of them. In fact, I'd say 95% of the time, any questions you have about whether something will align with the sector criteria, it's the criteria document here that's going to give you the answer. All of the sector criteria, they all have this criteria document. That's going to be your go-to source to determine whether a certification is highly likely to be possible. If, however, let's say you're in that 5% range, that the project, it's a little gray whether it would qualify or not. Or in all the examples we've given of eligible assets or activities, your project doesn't really fit. In that case, you would move on to a secondary document, which is the background paper. Okay, so again, these two documents are basically the universe of what you need to determine alignment. The background paper is sometimes 2, 3, even 4 times as long as the criteria document, but it has a lot more information and explains how the decisions were arrived at by the technical working group, the industry working group, and our standards team. So again, these two documents will provide everything you need. One other point on this matter, there's sometimes an assumption that there is a barrier or a curtain of information that we have. And we don't have anything like that. What I mean by that is there's no information that we have on a given sector criteria or standard that isn't made public. So in other words, if the information isn't here, the only way we could get an answer in certification is by escalating the question to the standards team, which is completely separate from us. So again, the information we have is the same information you have. And in rare circumstances, we do have to escalate to get an answer, but most of the time, by far, the criteria document alone will provide the answers you need. I'm also going to point out very quickly 2 tools that help make this go a lot easier. First is using the word search function. If you open the criteria document, and if it's 75 pages long, you don't have to read all 75 pages. If you're looking up the word, for example, glass aggregate, if it were a waste management project, a Mac or a PC, you can hit Command F or Control F, type in the word glass aggregate, and in the criteria document, you'll come to the one mention of that word, and it will show you that those projects do not qualify, right? So it'll save you a lot of reading time. I would strongly suggest you use the word search function. It'll make your life a lot easier. Second one is the snapshot tool. If you're reading a section or a table, or there's a graph and it's not so clear, you can, on a Mac or PC, again, you can take a snapshot of that part of the screen and you can mark it up, you can type on it with text, and you can send that to the investment bank or the engineer or the verifier and save yourself having to type everything up and attach the document and so on. So 2 tools I recommend as a slight digression, just to make the whole process easier. So the first step, again, was to check the sector criteria. The second step is to check the climate bond standard. These don't have to be necessarily in sequence. You could check the standard first, but usually the question is, will the assets or activities qualify? So once you've determined that, then it would be prudent to go through the standard. And again, it's available on the website, and just make sure that the type of instrument you want to set, the types of timelines and everything, that it conforms to your needs, and it also meets the needs of the standard. The third step, if you need any other additional guidance, this would be more relevant specifically to a verifier, would be to check the guidance documents. On the website, we have a page called Resources for Issuers and Verifiers. And the 2 documents for guidance are, one, the Assurance Framework, version 2. You can download it. And secondly is the Guidance for Verifiers, version 2, and you can download that right under here as well. These are the links that you'll be able to see in the recording of this for those pages if you'd like to check them out. And now I'd like to transition into the masterclass on verifying green debt issuances. So I've put this together, this masterclass, using these sources here. And I'd like to just give a quick thanks to the people here, Lauren Jones, Jackie Mercer, Christine Shu, Matt Spinagle, and Patrick Hardy, who put together for Environment Canada back in 2006, the Greenhouse Gas Division, the training program for that, which I was a part of. And it really helped me in my career and really kind of set the foundation for work in validation and verification. So it's a very, very, very useful resource since I did that. These are the resources here. Again, you can check them out in the recording. We're going to start by talking about the generic verification process. So basically, these are the steps for the verification process: engagement, planning, risk assessment, ongoing records management, testing and fieldwork, evidence gathering and documentation, and lastly, reporting.
We lost Brian again. He is connecting. He should be back in a few seconds. Please bear with us while we fix this. Hi, Brian. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Just one
Okay,
moment.
great.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, legal and company details. So that would be, for example, the registration number, name and address of the issuers, contact people, key contacts. That would be for the verification team and any subcontractors involved. The timing would be the period during which the verification engagements will be carried out, and some type of statement specifying who will receive a copy of the assurance report in that case. Let's move on to planning. Basically, you'd have a verification plan. It will show an understanding of the type of nominated projects associated with the debt issuance. And it would have to show an understanding of the issuer's systems and processes to monitor the flow of funds from the investors to the nominated projects and assets. That's really the key here. It's going to show the structure of the debt instrument, the proposed testing procedures, timeline, and roles. But really the key is we want to see the systems and processes to monitor that flow of funds. Okay, that's what the planning should center around, is exposing that. In terms of risk assessment, here we want to map out key elements of the issuance. This is good to take stock of risk sooner rather than later. What are the possible types of errors that can happen? What is their probability of occurrence? Are there some technical aspects of the projects or assets that have to be looked into deeper and that might prove a problem in terms of resources available to do so? Again, the flow of funds and any additional aspects that might be particularly tricky with the assignment at hand. In terms of managing records, this can't be understated. So you need to document your processes, your findings, everything basically that leads you to the conclusion that you're going to make. You can do this different ways. You can do it ad hoc. So as you're performing the verification work, you can have kind of a ledger beside what you do and you record, the process as you perform it. Some people will mark their calendar and have a full kind of fleshing out records management session once a week. Maybe they block a 1 or 2 hour chunk of time once a week to go over and update everything. That's up to you, but regardless of how you do it, it should be a continual process. And it should be initiated even before a contract is signed between a verifier and an issuer. So again, this can't be understated. Testing and fieldwork. Again, you want to document everything. Are there testing procedures and what are they going to be? And also the issuances, systems and processes. Anything that you need to do to basically assign or give a limited or reasonable assurance statement. Next, we have evidence gathering and documentation. Here you want to document the evidence that appeared and the evidence that is directly related to what you need to know. If you need to seek written confirmation for anything, make sure you have copies of those written confirmation. If you, for example, depending on the assignment, if you've been given a temporary email address, when you're getting written confirmation, you might want to use an email address that you'll control after the assignment completes and you no longer have access to it. So you want to have these written confirmations as well form part of the working papers if that's possible. Basically, when you're documenting the evidence, the documentation, you want everything to be repeatable and replicable. Those are kind of the key pillars of doing this right. Lastly, with reporting, a verification report for our purposes, there can be two formats. There can be a public version and a private version. That's okay. We would put the public one on the website to show the issuance. And sometimes, privacy is needed when you're specifying certain assets, for example. That's okay too, but we need to have it on file. And that's the one that we're going to use for the certification, the private one. Conclusions for certification, again, from the verifier, it has to be limited or reasonable assurance. Qualified reasonable assurance would also be possible where you have a strong assurance statement with a slight qualification, but either way, it's limited or better. And we prefer transparency across the board. So if there are errors, if there are misstatements, some verifiers use a process where they disclose any errors that occurred and what they did to rectify those errors. That's good practice. So we encourage that. What I'd like to do before moving on to the section of audit risk is I'd like to give everyone a 5-minute break just to stretch our legs. I have a timer, so when you hear me talking again, that's when we'll start. But yeah, I'd like everyone to have a 5-minute break. We'll come back and we'll resume the masterclass, and we'll also get a chance to meet our case study guests. So thanks, and I'll see you soon. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to start the second half of this masterclass. I'm going to finish the masterclass portion, and then I'm going to introduce our guest speakers to talk about the case study. So let's talk a little bit about audit risk. So audit risk is the likelihood that a verifier will deliver an incorrect opinion. And audit risk, you can break it down into three sub-risks, which you can see in the diagram here. On the left-hand side, you have inherent risk, and this is the risk of an error due to a project's complexity or the lack of the issuer's capacity to be involved with the project. That could be from the issuer or the verifier, rather. Examples of inherent risk would be additional requirements for a specific project that digress from a procedure that is, more standardized and understandable. It might be where there are numerous sites or different types of assets or activities, maybe across multiple jurisdictions. That makes it inherently risky. If there is a complex or a novel technology that's involved, or if the data collected on site, if that's collected manually, right? It could be subject to the manipulation or simply error, right? That makes it inherently risky. So there's all kinds of different reasons, but that's inherent risk. The second type of risk is control risk. And that's the risk that the issuer's control procedures and the information system will not allow the verifier to detect a discrepancy or to rectify it. So examples of projects with higher control risk are any undertaking that has an unusual corporate structure, right? That would present a control risk. Or if a verifier is dealing with an issuer that has high staff turnover, that's a control risk. Where the issuer is simply overconfident that everything is okay, or where on the issuer side, or for the end user of funds as well, where there might be multiple individuals or departments with overlapping responsibility. Or if there's no quality management or a very poor one in place. That's all control risk. And lastly, we come to detection risk. And this is the one where the detection risk is that the verification body or the verifier won't be able to identify a material discrepancy. So examples of detection risk could be any of the examples I just mentioned that could augment detection risk, or specifically, if the data collection and management, if that were done very differently across different sites, that would indeed make it hard for a verifier to make a reliable assertion. Or, for example, where there is sometimes reluctance or even an adversarial attitude towards the verifier from one of the stakeholders whose input is critical, that will make it hard to detect something. Fortunately, not all of this rests on the verifier's shoulders. Detection risk is on the verifier. That's the verifier's responsibility, but inherent risk and control risk are not. So, of course, if control risk and inherent risk are very high for a given project, then the verifier has to compensate and take extra steps to try to lower the detection risk. So it means it's going to require more work. It's going to require, likely a higher number of hours for the assignment, and it's probably going to require more record keeping and documentation as well. But again, here you can see in the diagram, this is where the verifier can kind of make up for the gap. And this here would be the acceptable for needed level of assurance. That's the tolerable level of risk. The key to all of this is doing the work that needs to be done. And that means having clear priorities and maintaining a really robust paper trail. The paper trail acts as the record that the verifier acted professionally, thoroughly, and performed his or her duties within the required scope of the assignment. In other words, it will show that no stone was left unturned. You're going to have that documented And you'll have that in the working papers. Levels of assurance for certification. As I mentioned before, for certification, it has to be either limited assurance or reasonable assurance, one of those two only. Limited assurance, it's also known as low assurance or negative assurance or neutral assurance. And the typical wording for it reads like this: based on the procedures, nothing has come to our attention that causes us to believe that the issuance is not, in all material respects, in accordance with the requirements. Reasonable assurance, which is stronger, also known as high assurance or positive assurance, that will read along the lines of, based on the procedures conducted, the issuance is free from material discrepancies in accordance with the standards. So it's a more confident statement. Something else that can help us navigate these types of risks, for example, as a verifier, is basing your decision on principles. When something is gray and you have to call it, as we say, you go back to principles. And you can always, when you have a fork in the road or a decision to make, as you're documenting what you're doing, not just what you're doing, but you're documenting the process itself, you can even write that down. Observing neutrality, I did X, Y, Z, or to ensure completeness of the data, I did this or that. And again, you can add that to the working papers. It's a highly professional thing to do so. The principles themselves, according to ISAE 3000, mnemonic to remember them, if you want to memorize these, is NURC, N-U-R-R-C. Neutrality, neutrality, it basically results in subject matter information that's free from bias and is appropriate for the circumstances. Understandability means it can be understood by the intended users. Relevance means that the subject matter that you're sharing, it assists in decision-making by the intended users. It's something they can actually use. Reliability will show that it's relevant, you've presented and disclosed everything you need to, and that this is a way of doing things that's used in similar circumstances by different practitioners. And lastly, completeness. It will show that you've included the benchmarks and for presentation and disclosure. You haven't omitted any relevant factors that could reasonably expected to affect decisions of the intended users. And basically, these are the 5 that are required by us. And again, if you have them in the back of your mind, it can help you make decisions. Let's move on to evaluating evidence. So this is a very helpful way of filtering and prioritizing what can be, depending on the project, possibly an abundance of data that you have to sift through. And one helpful way to help you do that, to help you prioritize what's really important, is just to understand the relationship between appropriateness and sufficiency when it comes to auditing these types of projects. Sufficiency of evidence means it relates to the amount of evidence that is required to reach a conclusion. So there's no specific rule of thumb for sufficiency, but it's achieved when you feel confident enough to make a decision and that you believe that your decision would stand amid the scrutiny of your peers and reasonable external critics. So if there's no rule of thumb, but you can think about it that way. Appropriateness of evidence, that relates to the persuasiveness of the evidence, the information you have. To be appropriate, the evidence has to be relevant and it has to be reliable. By relevant, we mean that the evidence will assist you in achieving the verification objectives directly. By reliable, we mean that the evidence is authentic, it's credible, and it's dependable. And sorry, I meant to have this screen up, but here you can see the relationship between sufficiency in terms of the amount of evidence required and the appropriateness of evidence. The more appropriate the evidence, the less required to draw a conclusion. So if you have the exact number or the exact observation or piece of evidence you need, then you don't need a lot of extra evidence, right? That might actually just confuse the report and its findings in the first place. You can see that on the graph here. If something is highly appropriate for the situation, then you don't need much of it. On the other hand, if you're dealing with a very gray area, something maybe very new, you're going to need a lot of evidence to have the sufficiency of your claim because it's lacking in appropriateness. So this can be a very helpful way of understanding where to draw the line in terms of what evidence to include and what not to include. It can give you some confidence in making that decision. The hierarchy of evidence is also a way of thinking about the information that's going to be relevant. We have, for example, here reliability. If it's very, very reliable, if it's highly reliable, it would be up here. And then with less reliable information would be down here. So for example, very, very relevant information, very reliable would be direct personal knowledge. That would be something that maybe you've obtained through physical observation or through your own mathematical computations. 2, documentary evidence that may be obtained directly from reliable, independent external sources. 3, documentary evidence that has originated outside the issuer's data processing system, but it has been received and processed by the issuer. 4 would be internal evidence that includes documents produced, circulated, and stored within the issuer's information system. Internal evidence can typically be relied upon if they're produced under satisfactory conditions of internal control. And you have to determine in that case, whether that would fly. And 5 would be spoken and written representations by the issuer's officers, directors, owners, employees, etc. These should be corroborated by other types of evidence. A simple interview, that wouldn't really cut it in most cases. Next, to go into record keeping, which again can't be understated, the rule of thumb is to overdo it. It doesn't mean submit everything you come across, but in general, you want to have more notes than you need. The records for a specific undertaking for a verifier, we call them the work papers or the working papers. And at a minimum, these would be the 4 sections that would include. You would have notes on the engagement details. You would talk about the background of the project. That's very important. The audit process itself, that might take on several different formats. It might have a Word document, a spreadsheet. It might have a ledger or a journal or a diary, and communication and reporting, a section for that as well. However you set it up, as long as it has these 4 sections, you'd be operating at a high level of professionalism. And lastly, I'd like to talk about impartiality and conflicts of interest before we move on to our guest speakers. So there will always be threats to impartiality. Here are 5 that I found very, very real, operating with validations and verifications myself in the past. A threat of impartiality is, when you're working, this is a source of revenue. A threat from a client paying for the verification report, or where the verifier receives a material portion of the revenue from this specific client, from this issuer, or where you're receiving fees from the issuer for another engagement at the same time, unrelated. Again, it puts pressure on the relationship. Acting in your own self-interest. If there's a big name issuer and you want to secure that big name, that might be a threat to your impartiality. Self-review, the threat from having to review your own work. For example, where the verifier has provided advisory services over the proposed debt issuance of the issuer's Greenbone Framework that is the subject. That would be an issue. Familiarity or trust, the threat of the verifier being too familiar or trusting of another person instead of seeking verification evidence. And lastly, intimidation. There could be a threat. It could be tacit, or it could be openly expressed, where you're coerced potentially to be replaced or taken off the project or reported to a supervisor. These are all important things to have in the back of your mind while you work. One way that the IASB, the way it's approached within IASC is to make a conflict of interest checklist. And this is a practice that can be very useful. It's also quite simple. In Part B of the IASB code, it shows you what you need to take into consideration. This is what the handbook looks like here. And if you go to pages 31 to 36, within 6 pages, you can basically get the information you need and make your own conflict of interest checklist. And what this can do, it can really simplify things because it'll show that you've gone through some type of process to maintain your impartiality. And if in the future you were ever called upon something, maybe something came out in the media about a certain issuance or something, at the very least, you could go back to this and show that you've done something to mitigate the risk of threats to your impartiality. So that's a good practice to keep in mind. I'd like now to move on to the final part of this masterclass. And I'm very grateful to have both the issuer and the verifier for the issuance with me here today. We're going to look at a startup's certification journey. And Osmar, thank you so much for being with us here today. This is Osmar from umgrauemeio, 1.5 degrees Celsius in Brazil. He's the co-founder and CIO, Sustainable Innovation. Omar, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone attending the Climate Bond Training Academy. And it's an honor to be here. Thank you also to the team that made it all possible. So I'm here. Let's talk about our journey, our Cbi certification journey. And as you just explained, there was some stages that we should follow and that endorse what we are doing. So you can move to the next step, please, Brian. The urgency of a challenge starts with the wildfires. As you know, in the last 2 years, wildfires around the world had the highest intensity and CO2 emissions within the last 18 years. The loss of biodiversity, such as in the Amazon forest, will take decades to recover. And the toxic smoke from wildfires aggravate respiratory health problems, aggravated also by the pandemics in Brazil. And also financial losses. We see entire counties burning all over the world for the private sector, such as forestry and agriculture. So please, Brian, the next slide. As I don't know if all of you know about that data, but only a few years ago, the emissions from wildfires start to be measured and compared to other sectors of the economy and also to deforestation. And in Brazil, in drier years, it's the highest emission considering, and if we don't stop emissions from wildfires, it won't be enough to go net zero. We got to stop the wildfires in order to tackle that problem. Please, Brian, the next. So considering that fact, we developed Pantera, which is a fire management as a platform. Please, next one, Brian. Pantera platform framework translates the foundations of firefighting into tech solutions to provide operational and SDG impact indicators by tackling wildfires in their early stages. Well, the first step is prevention and preparation. So we got the risk maps in order to position fire brigades in the best spots, but also the fire scar maps, which analyzes the impact of fire and also the emissions of those fires. The second step is the real-time detection. We use high-resolution cameras, AI technology, to detect wildfires within 3 minutes at a 15-kilometer radius covering 70,000 hectares. We also use satellite detection as a backup. Due to the random availability and capacity, it takes maybe sometimes hours to days to detect. And fast response, which has supported considering communication, mobilization, firefighting planning from Pantera fire outbreak solution. And the third It's when we bring measurable and tangible data generated to endorse operational and SDG impacts, such as CO2 emissions reductions from wildfires. Next one, Brian, please. So why did we certify our green insurance? Because as our name says, our purpose is our mission and our name. So it's a powerful communication tool for us. And also to inform all stakeholders about our SDG impacts. And I always say that it's not about money, but what money are you endorsing? Is the money for good? Money that is not sponsoring the damage of the planet, that is providing benefits for all living beings. This next one, Brian. What made our certification go smoothly? Of Bureau Veritas, Vervuurt advisory and support. Alex was very important during the process by guiding us, telling us the right track. And to be also, we were already engaged by proving our impact, participating in accelerations, participating in frameworks, as such as the United Nations Global Network Initiative, which were our first framework, our COP. So it was the base for our certification framework. Next one, Brian, please. Well, what we have learned, the first round is a learning journey. You will learn about what you need to show, how you need to adapt your framework. And also, you got to have an aligned partner to make it smoothly, just like luckily we have with Bureau Veritas. And also one thing that came really at our minds, because as a startup that we were always looking for VCs in order to raise money, in order to finance our work. But it was a little bit hard for us searching for VCs and speculative money. And maybe it's one of the most important learnings that if you can deliver real impact and provide profits by doing it, maybe you don't have to look for a VC. Maybe. One thing that really closed that lesson learned is that we always must put purpose before profit in order to do the right thing. So next one, Brian, please. And how has certification helped us? We are always challenging ourselves. We always want to prove what we do. We want to walk the talk. We just don't want to be greenwashing what we do. So the capacity to improve the traceability of our impact, it's very important for us. And also by endorsing our traceability and impact, improve and increase the projects, and that will impact the lives of people and the environment. So it also endorsed our environmental and social responsibility. It was very important for us. Next one, Brian, please. Well, this is where we are today in Brazil. We are studying a project in Pantanal. I don't know if many of you followed last year. Pantanal lost a huge part of its area. And as you see at the right side of the screen, the companies that are endorsing the green transition, that are aiming to sustainable projects. So now we are in 11 states of Brazil, protecting all 6 diverse biomes of our country. And we are about to reach 86 towers, 17 situation rooms all over Brazil, as you can see in the map. Please, Brian, next one. Well, thank you very much. That's my contact, my telephone number. If you want to know more about details of our solution, I'm at your service, and I'm here to answer all questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Osmar, for that. Just wanted to ask, to point out for the audience as well, the traditional way that this forest fire prevention was done was through satellite, right? And that took a lot of time, basically. And during that time, the fire would get out of control. And the way you do it is a much quicker response time. Can you just comment on that a little bit? Like you put the cameras above the trees?
Sure. We consider prevention methodologies such as controlled burn, when you clean all the probable biomass on the ground. Satellites is a way of backup detection. Considering, as you called, satellite detection as a prevention, but we call it detection. Of course, satellite will provide all information to analyze prevention. But considering satellite as the way that most countries and communities use to detect wildfires, the major difference considering satellites and cameras is the availability. We provide cameras installed on top of towers, as you said. Those cameras rotate 360 degrees looking for wildfires, and it detects wildfires within the time of 3 minutes, covering 70,000 hectares. Of course, we made a line to automatic detection, but the camera can see much farther than that. And we are already having detections far from 70,000 hectares. So satellites, the greatest difference is the satellite, you don't know where it will be available at the time you need it. Maybe you can detect the fire around 20 minutes, maybe in 2 days. So it's not a thing that will help the protocols of mobilization and communication to act. So that's the main difference. You can see it and you can act on it. That's it.
Yep, thank you. Okay, we're going to move on then. I'm going to introduce Alex Vervuurt. He's the lead auditor, sustainability verifications at Bureau Veritas in Brazil. Alex, thank you for being with us here today.
Okay, Brian, I want to thank you in the name of Bureau Veritas and taking part of this conversation and this presentation. Okay, so after the explanation of Omar, I want to explain, and also after the presentation that Brian made, that was, I think, very precise, explaining how verification works, so very detailed, I think. So having just like 10 and 15 minutes, I will be very focused on how we did the verification of this project from umgrauemeio. So I'm going to show the steps that we have followed using the documentation that is available, mainly from the Cbi. And okay, we may move to the next one, right? Good. So it's very clear what we had as the project. So it's a fire detection system, in this case in natural forests. So the set of documentation that we have here to work with is the climate bond standard 3.0 from the Cbi. It brings 2 moments of verification, what Brian explained. So we had the pre-issuance verification. So the requirements, they are set in this climate bond standard. This was what we did in September from this year. And the next step of the verification will be the post-issuance verification. So the climate bond standard also brings the requirements that are needed for the second phase. I will comment on this later. What we have here is also the ICMA principles for the green bond that are also used by the Cbi. So the climate bond standard is also based on the 4 green bond principles. And this is the main system to proceed this verification. So all what we did is based on one of the 4 green bond principles. So I will show you how we have proceeded this using the 4 principles. So yeah, let's move to the next one. When we get to the use of proceeds, and Brian also explained a lot about this step, because it's one of the most important steps to avoid greenwashing, to know what kind of project really may receive this green label. So in this case, we have found in the taxonomy of the Cbi, the forestry activities. So they are with this blue flag. That means that this criteria is already available for certification to be used to be used as criteria. So it's the first step of the use of proceeds is to find if you have this in the taxonomy, the type of activity that we are searching for. So this is done. Okay, next one, please. Then we move to the second part of the use of proceeds is to review the review of the project against the CBI forestry criteria, because now we know we need to work on this criteria specifically. The scope of the forestry criteria, we need to find if the activity fits with the scope, with the available scopes in the criteria. So in this case, we found the project relating to forest conservation, because this is what umgrauemeio is doing, in fact, with this fire detection. Also very important in the forestry criteria is to pay attention for these key elements to the criteria. So significant attention to climate risk and a clear plan for achieving positive effects on operational resilience. Very important to have in mind. Okay, next one. Then when we move further in the criteria assessment, we found in the forest conservation who have aligned with the protection from deforestation risk, and specifically the cost of setting up and maintaining protection measures. So monitoring equipment, it's set on this way, it's defined in the criteria. So it's a very clear alignment with the forestry criteria. I mean, this activity of umgrauemeio. Interesting is to understand how the criteria work. All of the 16 criteria from the CBI, they have like 3 elements. So you have the mitigation, and you have the adaptation and the resilience elements. When we move assessing the elements of those criteria, you will always find requirements based on the mitigation and requirements based on adaptation and resilience. When you find a green bullet in those elements, this means there is no further documentation required. In the case when you have an orange or another color here, and sometimes it means that you may not move forward with this project because it's not eligible, or you need to fulfill additional requirements. And then most of the criteria, they have a set of checklists that you need to go through to assess information. It's a kind of direction that you need to follow when assessing information from the project itself. So when it's right done, this information, it's included in the framework, and sometimes we need to assess information from the project itself, so the company who owns the project. In this case, it was clear to us that there was no need for further documentation. Okay, next one, please. Well, then we move to the second principle. This is related to the process for evaluation and selection of the project. We need to think that this whole certification process is normally a long-term certification. So it's very clear that the Greenbone principles also put some requirements on the governance. And this is specifically about the second principle. So we need statement on the climate-related objective of the bond, governance relating to environmental sustainability, and to understand the process of selection of the nominated project. So the eligibility itself done by the issuer. This is also very important for the next step, for the post-issuance verification, because we will need this to specifically to check whether eligibility and also the use of proceeds will remain during the term of the bond. Because I mean, it's very, I think, very clear to all of us that certification is not just this first moment of the pre-issuance emission. Okay, let's move to the third one. Then we have the third principle. It's about the management of the proceeds. So this is also very, very important for the post-issuance verification to verify whether those proceeds are being used on the way they were described in the framework itself. So you have the first documentation in the beginning of the process, and then this will keep moving until the end of the use of the proceeds, until the end of the term of the bond. So what we have checked here is traceability of the proceeds. So if the company has a right internal tracking system, the allocation according to eligibility criteria, the balance of unallocated proceeds, because you don't have the use of the proceeds just in one moment. This may take until 2 years. In case that you have financing or refinancing of the project, it's also important to take into account earmarking of the funds, demonstrating the share of this proceed, use it for those both situations. This is also very, very important to be verified during the post-issuance audit. I mean, this is really what will give the reliability of the whole process. Okay, next one. And then we have the fourth principle. This is about Greenbone Framework itself. So a lot of companies, they are asking us how, if it's complicated to establish a framework, how difficult it is to have a framework. What I always tell is the framework is just information that you need to describe the whole operation. And then regarding to those four principles. So it's not a need to be a very complicated document. You don't need to go further than the needs of those principles. Also important, the framework needs to be available for public. And here is where it said that it needs to be written. You need to have this framework written before of the issuance, and it will be used over the years, over the time that you have the bond and also the certificate valid. Okay, next one. Okay, so when we went through those four steps from regarding the principles, our conclusion, also we have surely checked a lot of internal documentation from umgrauemeio regarding the project itself. So this is in our report, the description of how the system itself works, or how its cameras with the use of satellite images, and also regarding costs of the whole system. In the end, we have concluded that the climate bond standard and the forestry criteria, they were both met. And the framework was also available for public. So we have, based on this, we have written our verification report, and this goes all to the Cbi data bank. So here I have put just one image showing where you can find this information in the CBI data bank. So you move to the certification button, and then the certification bond database, and there you can find all the projects that are certificated that are in this CBI database. So this one is also available for consult. It's one part of our verification report it has confidential information, and one part it's open to public. So this is a short explanation on how we did this verification. It is much richer in details, of course, but in the time that we have to explain this, I tried just to put this flow to you, just to explain how it works. So Brian, thank you. I think the last one is just the end. Good, that's it.
Thank you very much, Alex. So before we wrap things up, we're going to have a Q&A. Just wanted to point out that we have a resources pack, and there's a feedback form as well. The resources pack will be here. You'll have it available in the recording. It has all kinds of helpful, interesting links. And I'd also like to give a big thanks again to our many sponsors for the conference. And I'd like to open the floor to question and answers to whoever has them. You can ask the case study guests themselves if you'd like to as well. We're just waiting to see if anything comes up via the question and answer channel. I have one question. This would go to Osmar. So did your company start out with venture capital, and then once it had kind of a provable use of technology that could have a return on investment, that's when you decided that the bond market would be a better source of capital for you to get your needs met?
No, Brian. In fact, we've been bootstrapping until now. We've been with our own resources, looking at the private traditional bank market in Brazil, which Alex knows it's pretty hard for a small company to access taxes and to access growth incentives. So luckily, our first what venture capital would call Series A, that this bond operation, it became our Series A somehow. We just didn't have to access the venture capital. When I spoke that it was hard because we always had to prove ourselves, not in order to prove the impact, but you got all those letters that you have to prove if you have a CAC, if you have a PAC, and all these small letters that in the end doesn't mean for us much as to bring the impact and to bring the purpose before the profit. There's a saying that once I heard that take care of the venture capital, of the private equity in the skin of venture capital. So now that we reached the bonds, for us, it makes a lot of sense in order to grow our operation, in order to have a patient money to help us bring the impact that we want to bring, to solve a real problem solution, a real human problem. So that's like companies such as ours and other companies that the hashtags naming climate tax, which brings together science and sensibility. That's the speculative money. It's not the money for companies such as ours. And there's plenty of good companies to bring the green transition. So that's it. That's why we are not. We did not identify ourselves with the venture capital market.
Thanks for that. One question has come in. It would be for the verifier in this case, so for Alex. And it's what evidence was assessed for the sector requirements for this forestry issuance? Can you comment on that in terms of what you had to look at?
Yeah. Okay, Brian. Thank you. When we have our own way of proceeding audits. I mean, Bureau Veritas has an own protocol to define what is an evidence, what kind of evidence we need to collect from the companies. We use normally checklists for receiving this checklist. We use checklists in the beginning of the process defining what kind of documentation we need to collect. So in this case, when we follow the forestry criteria itself, it doesn't ask for a lot of evidence. It's what I showed when I showed the green bullets. And so what we did is using our own protocol to collect evidences like the financial balance of umgrauemeio, information regarding the formalization of the company itself, because it's a startup company. So we needed to find out how formalized this company is in the market. We also have checked information regarding the first financing of bonds, because there is a part of this issuance that is a refinancing of the bonds. So we have checked how this was considering the balance of the net proceeds that umgrauemeio is receiving, and also technical information about the project itself. So understanding how it works. This is important to us because we need to see how this will work in time. So it's also maybe one important point to tell that we have also in our report and in the framework it says that the monitoring of fire detection, so the time of monitoring and also emissions avoided, they're also part of the monitoring data that umgrauemeio needs to show to CBI and also to us in the first post-issuance verification in order to prove that it really works. So this is a bit from information that we have assessed. So one part is financial information and one part is the technical information. And this is all described in a checklist that we have. So we put all the evidences that we have collected.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Another question from the audience for Osmar. The question is, does this process that you have, does that extend to vines or fires that would cause risk potentially to other types of land, such as agricultural land? Can you comment on that?
Sure. I don't know if you notice, but we have a few private sector companies in forestry and agriculture, and every fire-prone agriculture or forestry culture can be protected. It can protect not only forests, not only private sector productive land, but it also can protect cities. It also can protect people from the fire. It's overall fire outbreak detection, which will be applied to private sector or to a country that suffers with fire. We've been speaking with Portugal. Portugal, there is a characteristic that the productive areas are small areas. So you got a lot of small areas together, such as vine, olive trees, forestry, such as eucalyptus trees. So it's not only a sector problem, it's a national problem due to a big number of small areas from different owners and from cities in between them. So yes, it's applicable to every fire-prone necessity area on the planet.
Great. Thank you, Osmar. One other question has come in. How far along from concept to feasibility does a project need to be before starting to work on the possible use of a green bond program for funding? I guess Osmar, that would land in on your side as well. Shall I? Do you get that, or shall I repeat the question?
Yeah, I should repeat the question. I thought it was more for Alex. He's the specialist, but he has more detail to share about that subject.
So yeah, and the question is for either of you. How far along from concept to feasibility does a project need to be before starting to work on the possible use of a green bond program for funding purposes?
If you want me to start, Osmar, because we receive all the time this kind of questions. And it's a very good question, because I think this is something that's really new in the certification world, when you think that we may certificate a concept project. So it's really important to have a very clear line from the moment that you may enter the certification process. I mean, you need information, but it's a project. So if we think about the system itself of the certification, we are talking about the pre-issuance certification. So you have an operation being formed. So you have the financial part of this operation searching for the good money. And you have on the other side, you have technical experts searching for good projects. So when this combined, when you have this together, then you may start talking about certification. But we may have a concept project, especially in the cases where you have a kind of repetition of projects. I can give an example, solar farms. Solar farm in Brazil, they are being repeated. So we know already what kind of projects are being established. So we have this information, but when we start such a project with some companies who are already getting used to certify, you have just a concept. But it's a repetition from another project that is already executed. In a case that you have a really new project, very different from something that is already existing, then we need to see how much information and how reliable this information is. In the case specific of umgrauemeio, it is already an existing activity. So the system itself, with the cameras, with the detection system, already exists. What is new here in this case is that they are entering a new area. This was the Pantanal project. That is the new situation. It's an expansion of the activity of umgrauemeio. But it's very tricky to find out where's the line when you really may start with a new certification. It's a good question. We always have to keep this in mind.
Very good. Thank you, Alex. We have no more questions right now in the pipeline. I'm going to keep this open just in case anything comes up. But that's basically the end of the masterclass. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. The next session, we're going to have, excuse me one moment, just adjusting the screen here. Here we go. The next session will be from 4:30 to 6:30 CST, how to issue resilience bonds masterclass. And again, I'll be here for the next 5 minutes if any questions come up. But otherwise, thank you everyone for attending. And I hope you found it valuable, and the recording will be made available so you can listen to it again at your leisure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Brian, Osmar, and Marina. It was a pleasure to participate from the session.
Thank you very much, Brian, Marina, Alex, and I'm at your service. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Omar and Alex, for being with us today.